Hello and welcome to Church and State with Stephen Kokx. This is a show dedicated to all things Catholicism, all things politics, and everything in between. Well, ever since Vatican II, there's been an unresolved tension with how the Church's previous teachings on church-state relations and religious liberty are compatible with what the Church taught before. In recent years, scholars like Thomas Pink, John Lamont, and others have taken up this difficult question. The integralists at the josias.com website, like Father Edmund Waldstein, have attempted to do this as well. In my view, however, the obvious answer to all this is that the Council's document on religious liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, clearly is in rupture with what the Church previously taught. Indeed, one of its main architects, Father John Courtney Murray, an American Jesuit who had ties to the U.S. deep state, admitted in 1967, just 2 years after Vatican II, that, quote, the course of the development between the Syllabus of Errors, that was a document published by Blessed Pius IX in 1864, and Dignitatis Humanae still remains to be explained by theologians. So, it's quite the admission. What are we to make of this? And what are we to make of how the Church is operating today? And how does this actually even relate to what's going on in the Church today? Well, to discuss this and more is my guest today, American Reform. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me, Stephen.
Yeah, I've been following your work quite a bit on your Substack. If people don't know, American Reform runs a great Substack and Twitter account. We'll get into that in just a second. Obviously, this is a big topic too, and we'll focus primarily on religious liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, Vatican II today. But I do want to just let you introduce yourself to our viewers. You're obviously clued up, as they say, with the crisis in the Church as well as this particular issue. So really, why did you start your Substack? And I'm bringing that up on the screen right now. And what have you been writing about lately?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on your show. It's flattering in many ways, and I've enjoyed your work too, and read your Substack and enjoy your X posting as well. The main reason I began publishing at the Journal of American Reform is that I didn't see any other voices talking about some of these issues that are misunderstood today, or they're talking about them in ways that lack precision or doctrinal underpinnings. So a lot of the work I focus on is race and its relation to Catholicism. And I'm looking at older authors and how they treated the question, nationalism, as you can see there on the screen, the Jewish question, anti-liberalism, political philosophy. And I think that's very important here in America because many good Catholics have a lot of beliefs, unfortunately, that are at odds with the faith. And it's largely ignorance, but they don't have an appreciation really for the social teaching of the Church. Many things that we cherish in our country, unfortunately, were previously condemned. Religious freedom, and we're going to be talking about that mainly today. Mm-hmm. Absolute freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and I mean that is a bedrock principle in America, but it's something that is not correct. And so that's really the reason that I wanted to start this project, and that's why I've been publishing too. And then recently I've been working on a project of Father Maximilian Kolbe and some of his writings on Freemasonry, Judaism, and their intersection. And he goes through these are writings that, in my view, have been purposely buried because they're very inconvenient for the way he is used to bludgeon people that are talking about the Jewish peril and the enmity that exists between the church and the synagogue. And so oftentimes they will bring up him, but actually he said things that are wonderful. I mean, filled with charity, but he was very strong in defending the rights of the Catholic Church against her perennial enemies. And so I just finished up the last installment of that this week, and he was talking about the Judeo-Masonic peril. And previously he had written to Polish Freemasons, actually, and he told them that you guys are being controlled by, and he said, a fanatical clique of Jews. And that was his words. And so that is what he was writing about in the 1920s in his publishing house. And I think English speakers especially need to be more familiar with his writings because they're very helpful, not only in understanding the crisis in the church, but a lot of the political issues and who is who is empowered right now in our country and what is the character of the institutions. So if people are interested, they're more than welcome to check those out, and I think they've been received pretty well.
Yeah, I want to congratulate you. This is really original work, and it's thorny subjects for sure, but it's important to tackle these with candor and a dedication, devotion to truth, because especially when I think most people hear Father Kolbe, they think about concentration camps, how he was like a martyr, for World War II, and I'm not saying he wasn't, but there's a lot of like myths, like people want to claim Father Kolbe, right, for their cause, and we'll get into that in another episode. But that's I think I'll just say the prevailing narrative, or what we're told about Father Kolbe, as you mentioned, like he wrote a lot of things that today's churchmen, especially post Nostra Aetate, about the Israelites, would not be entirely kosher, right? So it's important to recover that, right? Kosher Catholicism is not something that Father Kolbe was a fan of. He was a truth teller, right? Just like we're trying to be, and like yourself is trying to be too. So keep up the great work on that. We'll get into that in another show. Today, though, we want to talk about, as I said at the outset, this topic of religious liberty. And, this has been a focus, I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I forget exactly when this sort of like had renewed interest. I know John Lamont, I mentioned, Thomas Pink, and other scholars have tried to just provide deeper scholarship on the question, right? Because some will argue, yes, Vatican II's document on religious liberty was in continuity. Some will say it wasn't. Lefebvre obviously took great issue with it, wrote a dubia to the Vatican. Before we even get into Vatican II and the relevance of this topic for today, and I think there really is a lot of relevance of this topic today for what's going on in the world and the church. We need to understand, like, what are the issues at play. So before we get into the council, what was, I suppose, the church's teachings before Vatican II on church-state relations and religious liberty? I from my understanding, really the church sort of solidifies its teachings in the 1800s after the French Revolution, because then the popes were combating liberalism and the growth of modernism. So maybe you can get us up to speed on sort of that era first, and then we'll talk about obviously the council later.
Yes, of course. And you're right. There was an awful lot that was written in the 19th century. And even Pope Pius VII in Postam Dieternus had identified religious liberty as a heresy explicitly. And that was in response to the French Revolution and their new constitution, where they were attempting to enshrine the so-called rights of man and all the liberal thought in their constitution. And so I think the best document to begin when looking at the tradition and how it has understood religious liberty begins with Pope Gregory XVI's Mirari Vos, where he's condemning religious indifferentism and liberalism. And the other one would be Quanta Cura, which is probably the most important because it was promulgated with the supreme apostolic authority of Pope Pius IX. And I think that's something that more people could benefit from realizing, is that if you look not only at the text itself, because you're trying to make the argument that it's a pontifical act ex cathedra, he's using his supreme apostolic authority. The language in there is very solemn, and he's actually reproving religious freedom, and he's saying it's against the doctrine of the church, of the scriptures, and of the fathers. And then he's using his supreme apostolic authority. So that's how the text reads on its face. But then what's very important is that if you layer in the theologians who looked at that document contemporaneously and those in the 20th century, they were unanimous in saying that it was also a pontifical act ex cathedra, which means that when he was condemning, Pope Pius IX, that is, when he was condemning religious freedom, it was an infallible condemnation, which means for the faithful, they have to give irreformable assent to that condemnation, which means anything that would be proposed at variance with that condemnation would have to be rejected. And so that's kind of what you're alluding to at the Second Vatican Council, we have that principle from St. Paul in Galatians 1:8, where he says, if we or an angel or anyone preach you a gospel and it was not the same, let him be anathema. And so that is, and St. Robert Bellarmine has commented on this too, that the faithful do have a negative right to judge their pastors, a strictly negative right. And it's only by comparing what they hear presently with what has come before. And you can recognize a contradiction between that. So if you want to talk about next about John Courtney Murray and some of the movers and shakers in the early 20th century, that's another very interesting topic, because then you have him being refuted in many ways by Father Fenton.
Yeah, and we will talk about that. I want to reiterate here what I just had on the screen too, to make sure our viewers understand this. This is what Pope Gregory the 16th wrote in 1832 about religious indifferentism. He said, the shameful font of indifferentism gives rise to absurd and erroneous propositions which claim that liberty of conscience must be maintained for everyone. It spreads ruin in sacred and civil affairs, though some repeat over and over the greatest imprudence that some advantages accrue to religion from it. He'll go on to say, thence comes transformation of minds, corruption of youths, contempt of sacred things, holy laws. It is a pestilence, he's saying. And he goes on to denounce freedom of speech, etc., freedom to publish anything you want. So this is like a sort of a denunciation, if you will, of like the American sort of founding, isn't it? I mean, when I read the popes of the 1800s and their condemnations of liberalism, which really just means, again, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to pretty much do whatever you want, other than disrupt public order. Again, that's the French Revolution attitude, right? Yes. Most people today are liberals. They just don't know it. That seems to me to be the most like damning thing against the American Constitution. Is that your read on things, or what are the popes actually saying here in the 1800s?
No, very much so. And that's why my project is American Reform, because, and it's regrettable, the problem really is at the founding itself. And it's an Enlightenment project. That is America. It was not set up with Christian principles, and even the principles enshrined at the founding and as understood by the founders are repugnant to just reason itself, unaided by the light of faith. And so that's where, if you just consider religious freedom and you think, okay, before the state, in religious and moral matters, truth and falsehood ought to be equated, having the same rights. I mean, reason itself tells you that's absurd. So you don't even need the Catholic faith to recognize that absurdity. And so that is enshrined at the very foundation of our country, unfortunately. And but it's a little bit more dangerous because the American state is indifferent. It's not decidedly atheistic, at least at the beginning, but the indifferent state inexorably leads to the atheistic state. And so that's what we see today, the state that's hostile to religion, but also the state that, and this is the beauty of these older papal encyclicals, especially Pope Leo XIII in Libertas. He talks about the duty of the state to worship God in the true religion. And that's a direct quote from Libertas. And so that's by virtue of the natural law. And then you also have quas primus in the 20th century, the social kingship of our Lord Jesus Christ. With the advent of the gospel, the state has a duty to recognize the Catholic religion and to uphold it, to favor it, to foster it. And so the American system is very errant, and it was actually condemned, and it's contrary to not only reason but the Catholic faith. And so most Americans are probably uncomfortable hearing that, but it's true nonetheless. And so everything we're seeing today is really a product of that early liberalism, that Masonic tendency in our country, and also the Protestantism. And that was kind of the mix of all three of those at the very beginning that set us up to fail.
Yeah. I want to bring up Father Fahey too here before I'll jump right back into that topic. Father Fahey was an Irish priest, 1900s, and he wrote a lot about religion and politics, as well as the people of the Old Testament. And he said at one point, when he defended Christendom, right, the Middle Ages, right? We always hear today, we're just bombarded with propaganda about the Dark Ages, right? People were just randomly getting killed for saying one little small thing. No, there was actually like a whole system set up to properly deal with all those things. And Father Fahey, I'll read the quote here, said, the state fulfilled its obligation of professing that religion which God himself established, and by which alone wants to be adored and worshipped. the Catholic religion, he said. And he went on. The Middle Ages grasped the formal principle of ordered social organization. The Inquisition, which everybody just hates today, was set up to defend order against the fomenters of disorder. So again, he's saying here basically that Christendom was the socio-political incarnation of Christ, where the state, which is a creature of God, recognized its duty to pay that debt of religion to God. And then comes along the founders, who were all Protestants or Masons or deists. And, they said, well, the state, the federal government does not have a duty to God. Now, state constitutions, they had different established religions, but of course they were all false. And over time, when you set up the idea of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, that's going to erode even just the natural law of things.
No, that's exactly right. And there's actually a really good quote from Pope Leo XIII in 1889 in E Junto, and it was to the Emperor of Brazil. And he wrote, quote, and actually just to summarize this, he's dissecting the religiously indifferent state along with the idea of freedom of worship, and he's linking it to the legal apostasy of society. And so he's actually warning this Catholic ruler in Brazil about embracing these principles. And he says, quote, freedom of worship considered in relation to society is based on the concept that the state, even in a Catholic nation, is not required to profess or favor any particular religion. Rather, it must be indifferent to all and regard them as legally equal. Such a form of liberty places truth and error, faith and heresy, the Church of Jesus Christ, and any human institution on the same level. It establishes a deplorable and disastrous separation between human society and God, its author, leading to the regrettable consequence of state indifferentism in religious matters, or, in other words, to state atheism. And he finishes it by saying, we have already in other public documents addressed to the Catholic world, and doubtless he's referring to Libertas and Immortale Dei there, demonstrated how erroneous is the doctrine of those who, under the seductive name of freedom of worship, proclaim the legal apostasy of society from its divine author. And so very, very strong condemnation of all these cherished American principles. And so I have written an essay on that, and this is kind of a whole different topic, but what's very unfortunate is that many American Catholics are more concerned about being good Americans before they are being good Catholics. Now, properly understood, to be a good American is not in conflict with the Catholic faith, obviously, but the way American is understood, certainly today and even historically, there has been a very real rupture between those two.
Right. And I'm bringing up here on the screen the article you've written about Father Straub, Jesuit, 1912. People can go and read that. Is that basically what you're getting at there? The political tolerance, that's acceptable, but per se, one cannot accept the false religions, the proliferation of false religions. Yeah. Yes.
And actually, many of the defenders of Dignitatis Humanae, they twist the document to mean political tolerance, which is a legitimate thing. But there is a distinction made between religious liberty, which was condemned, and then religious tolerance. And so the religious tolerance it's a real principle, but it presupposes an evil, which people will not usually admit, because tolerance is the toleration of an evil for the sake of a greater good. And like Father Straub was saying, and traditional theologians say this as well, per se, it's not lawful, but per accidens, you may permit religious tolerance for the sake of the common good, either to prevent some greater evil or to promote some greater good.
And that's what the church always taught. And let's advance this now. Let's go up to the council, because in the 1940s and 50s, there were voices like Father John Courtney Murray. We'll bring him up on the screen here. He was an American Jesuit who did believe at one point in the early 40s that the church's teachings on this topic were correct. And to just drive home the point, like the traditional teachings of the church is that error has no rights, right? Again, you can't afford the same, in principle, rights to truth and error. Otherwise, I mean, Adam would have been justified to eat the fruit, right? Adam didn't have a right to disobey, right? He had the duty to obey God's commands.
Exactly.
Right? So, but Father Murray comes along, and Murray was deeply embedded, for those who don't know, with the owner of Time magazine, Henry Luce, and his wife, who was a Catholic, and she was like a socialite diplomat. And they sort of influenced him, and he started to doubt the church's traditional teaching that, okay, in principle, and correct me where I'm going wrong here, In principle, the state has the duty to recognize the Catholic religion, but it can tolerate. In other words, that's the thesis position. And the hypothesis is that in times where religious pluralism is the norm, where the Catholic religion is not the majority, the church can say, we fight for the natural law. Of course, we need to rectify the situation eventually, that the state does eventually become Catholic. But then Father Murray comes along and he says, oh, we can't have that be the church's teaching, because the Protestants and the Jews and the conservatives, they view us as wanting a theocracy. They doubt our intentions. And so he went along and he got help with the deep state, especially the Dulles family. And you can talk more about Cardinal Dulles, I'm sure. He sort of made it his mission to basically obliterate that distinction, that, okay, the state has a duty. His goal was to say, okay, the American arrangement is a legitimately Catholic arrangement. So get us up to speed, if you can, on what happened before the council and where Father Murray comes to play a role in all this.
Yes, and you're right. He was a big influence on Dignitatis Humanae. He was not the sole author of it, but he was one of the major architects of that document. And he had very heterodox views that were refuted by Father Fenton in the American Ecclesiastical Review, and those are very good reading. They're a little bit heady, but they're very good reading if you can find those. And so he was putting forward this idea of.
Real quick, by the way, this is who we have on the screen here. This is Father Connell and Father Fenton, and I believe Connell is the one up on the right. Fenton is the one in the middle. They were debating Murray on the pages of American Ecclesiastical Review.
Yes, that's right. And Monsignor Fenton was actually the peritus of Cardinal Ottaviani at the council. Mm-hmm. And so I actually have and it's sorry to go back to the earlier point. Mm-hmm. So just under natural law, the state is bound to worship God and profess the true religion. And so with the advent of the gospel, now there's the added obligation to accept the Catholic religion, the only true religion. And that's proved a number of different ways. But so that is the traditional view, is that the state must recognize God, must recognize his church, uphold all of that. And in a very unfavorable situation where you have this religious pluralism, which should be repressed if you can, but there are certain circumstances in which it's not prudent to repress these false religions.
Right.
But in certain circumstances where you can't repress them in public, that is, giving authorization to these false religions, tolerance is permitted as an evil. Again, toleration presupposes an evil. And so that was really, really lost with Dignitatis Humanae. That traditional doctrine of tolerance was done away with. And actually, Father Murray, I have a good quotation from him, because you were referencing him, and he was quite honest about what he was doing. He said, this is taken from the documents of Vatican II with notes and comments by Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox authorities in 1966. He said, quote, "It can hardly be maintained that the Declaration Dignitatis Humanae is a milestone in human history, moral, political, or intellectual. The principle of religious freedom has long been recognized in constitutional law, to the point where even Marxist-Leninist political ideology is obliged to pay lip service to it. In all honesty, it must be admitted that the Church is late in acknowledging the validity of this principle. The Church does not deal with the secular order in terms of a double standard. Freedom for the Church when Catholics are in a minority, privilege for the Church, and intolerance for others when Catholics are a majority. The Declaration has opened the way towards new confidence in ecumenical relationships and a new straightforwardness in relations between the Church and the world." And so just a couple of quick comments on that. He's actually exactly wrong. The Church does deal with the secular order on a double standard, because she alone has a right to preach the gospel and to bring all nations to Christ and his church. So the Church does deal with the world in a double standard way in their eyes. It's not a double standard objectively, because rights are always specified by their objects, and air has no rights. So he's wrong on that point, but he is he is admitting what happened with Dignitatis Humanae and how it was in rupture with the Catholic teaching as it had been received previously. And then at the end, he kind of gives an indication as to why this was done, because you can't do ecumenism with Protestants or Orthodox if you say you have no right to practice your religion.
Right.
That ends
Yeah.
the ecumenical dialogue. And it's so that was the main impetus, at least from what I can tell from my research into why it was adopted.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll bring in a quote here from Father Fenton when he was debating Murray. He accused him of being a liberal, and of course we know he was. Actually, it was Cardinal George, who I used to work for in Chicago in 2010 and 11, when I was in grad school at the Archdiocese of Chicago, who said the church is indebted to the early liberal Catholics. So Cardinal George here, he's writing one of his recent books, I think it's 2005 or something, and that quote's from there. And so he's praising those early liberals who were getting condemned by Morari Vos and Blessed Pius the Ninth Quanta Cura, which we'll bring up in just a second. So he's saying it's great. And so Murray is the neo-Americanist, or the liberal who connects and tries to finesse the erroneous propositions of those who are condemned by Gregory XVI, and then to make them palatable. And Father Fenton notices this. He sees what's going on here, and he says the Americanism and heresy of modernism were both offshoots of doctrinal liberalism. All right, and so he accuses Murray of being basically an Americanist, which was a controversy that blew up in the 1890s in the U.S., and we'll talk about that maybe today. But he says this: the doctrinal liberals, he says, the most prominent of their errors of the new liberal Catholics were minimism. Okay, so going quiet on things like you're saying here, to not rock the boat with the Protestants, doctrinal subjectivism, and an insistence that there had been and that there needs to be again some change in the objective meaning and the church's dogmatic message over the course of the century. So he's like zeroed in, honing in like a missile, just blowing up their entire argument, and yet they keep pressing on. I mean, Murray was criticized by so many people, very sound scholars, who just couldn't even make sense of what he was writing. He was just bloviating. And I don't mean that term I mean that literally. People could not understand what he was saying. He just kept rambling on, and he got the patronage of the world for it. One year he was teaching at Yale philosophy department, and so that was his elevation by the deep state to have him more prominent. But his arguments were not making much sense. And as you're saying here, he was the bridge to sort of the council itself, and was trying to really attack the traditions, but he had opposition, and they knew what he was doing.
No, that's exactly right. And now Murray's to be credited for his honesty too, because he didn't really balk at the conclusions that he made. Some later figures were a little bit more subtle, and they were kind of sheepish in presenting their things. And actually, there's a project I'm working on now, and it'll be released in probably a couple of months. But I'm collecting all these different proofs from the post-conciliar magisterium and approved theologians, prelates, and many different sources to make this argument where the teaching of religious liberty as formulated in Dignitatis Humanae by their own authorities is at variance with Catholic teaching. And so just two quick ones, and then feel free to move on. So these are actually from the Acts of the Second Vatican Council. The first one is from Archbishop Antonius Baraniak. He says, quote, "It would be good to recognize that tragically there has existed at the very heart of the church institutions that oppressed religious freedom. This declaration on religious freedom would constitute a type of reparation towards those who suffered, at the same time prove the sincerity of the church in ecumenical dialogue." And he wrote that during the council. And then another one is Cardinal John Heenan, and he said, "Many Catholics, non-Catholics rather, imagine that on the question of religious liberty and tolerance, our position follows two different principles. When the church is weak and does not have the support of the civil power, that is to say, when Catholics are in the minority, we are all for freedom. But when the church is strong, that is to say, when Catholics are in the majority, we only talk about the rights of truth. They accuse us of suppressing the religious freedom of non-Catholics when we are strong enough to do it. In all honesty, we must make an examination of conscience and see to what extent this accusation is justified." So
Yeah, of course.
and they're spelling it out exactly, like descriptively what they're saying, the non-Catholics, all of that is all true. But it is true. The church has repressed and should continue in public these false cults from propagating their errors. And regardless of the intention of any individual man, it does not matter for what intention he is spreading these things. Objectively speaking, and in the public order, they're harmful. And they're actually sending souls to hell. So that's why the church has always been vigilant, and so has the state, in combating these erroneous views. And so you can't do ecumenical dialogue if you uphold the rights of God, the rights of the Catholic Church. You can't do that, and nor should we. And that's why there's no precedent of this kind of this false ecumenism that we've seen after the Second Vatican Council.
Yeah, and it was Murray himself, too, who wrote a memo to the Vatican in 1950. He said, there are many good non-Catholics here, but they fear that we want a theocracy. And here's the direct quote. A development on this teaching is desperately needed, and Murray's basically paranoid, to avoid alienation from the modern world. Now, what's curious about that memo was that I think it was Cardinal Spellman, and then also I think it was Father Connell, or maybe it was Fenton, you can correct me, also read that and wrote their response to it. And I think that the letter was actually sent to Montini in the 1950s. And Connell, and again, it might have been Murray or it might have, Connell or Fenton who wrote the response. And they said, whoever wrote this essay, again, they didn't know it was Murray, has no supernatural faith. I mean, like, whatever happened to preaching the truth in season and out, seeking converts, being willing to be persecuted by the world for our faith, alienation, like who cares about that? Like, we teach the truth, right? And that was the response. So, I don't know if you have a comment on that or not, but
no, that's right. And it is true that in certain circumstances, prudence may dictate that you not say everything, but you would never say anything that's false or affirm error or anything like that, obviously. And so I think one of the biggest problems with Dignitatis Humanae, and it's being ratified by Paul VI, is that the language and the clauses of that document, they imply infallibility. And so there's a big problem when you look at that text and you compare it to Quanta Cura. Just prima facie on its face, there is stark contradiction. And so there's a really good observation when the essay, you just brought that up there. This is a really good study if any of your viewers are interested in seeing if there is substantial continuity between those two documents, that is Quanta Cura, which was promulgated by Pope Pius IX, and Dignitatis Humanae. And so actually, if you scroll up real quick, Stephen, there's a good quotation right there from John Paul I, and that was taken from a current biography of him. And he said, quote, "The thesis I found hardest to live with was the one on religious freedom. For years, I had taught the public law theses of Cardinal Ottaviani, according to only which the truth, as held by the Roman Catholic Church, had rights. In the end, I convinced myself we had been wrong."
Wow,
so
that is fascinating.
Yeah, so there are a lot of those quotations out there. Archbishop Lefebvre has many of them in his book from Yves Congar. I'm sure you're familiar with all of those. But the biggest thing is looking at Quanta Cura and how that was an infallible condemnation. And you can look at the text and the language, but also the theologians and how they understood that. And they witnessed to it unanimously as being an infallible condemnation. And then you're seeing these doctrines that are being set forth in Dignitatis Humanae that are in contradiction with that, almost word for word contradiction with that. And so that is not merely asserted in this essay, and it is actually from Father Hervé Belmont that he makes this argument, but I think he demonstrates it. He doesn't merely assert it. And so if anyone's interested in checking that out, I would definitely recommend that.
So can you give us sort of an abridged rundown as to what the differences between Quanta Cura and Dignitatis Humanae are? What did Dignitatis Humanae seek to revise? And what specifically did Quanta Cura, you're saying, actually condemn beforehand?
Yes. So to really summarize it, it would be that quanta cura in the external and public forum, and that's an important qualification, in the external and public forum denied any right to religious freedom. That is a right for a non-Catholic to practice their religion, and related to that is the freedom of worship and conscience. And so it denied that infallibly, any right to that. And that's from quanta cura. And then in Dignitatis Humanae, it's set forth that there is this right in the public and external forum to freedom of religion. Conscience and worship come along with that within certain limits. And actually that had been mentioned too by Pope Pius IX too, that within certain limits. So if you go back to that essay, there are propositions, and they're just set one against the other, and you can see that very clearly. Let's see. So if you go to number 2, the opposition. I believe it's right below that. The text, scroll down, please.
Dignitatis Humanae?
Yes. So he says, on one hand, the propositions B and C condemned by quanta cura are equivalent to the propositions B prime and C prime taught by Dignitatis Humanae. And I know this is a little bit technical, but if anyone is interested in this, and this is a very scientific argument where he's making that rupture known and evident. And then the other thing I was mentioning earlier is that there is a survey forthcoming to back this up with the arguments from the conciliar authorities. They're approved theologians, they're prelates, cardinals, bishops. Many of them have said things that just confirm the reading of many traditionalists and looking at these documents. And so that's kind of the problem for the defenders of Dignitatis Humanae, is that they always have recourse to these private, unapproved interpretations of the documents. So they're actually at variance with the public and official interpretation. So the right to interpret Dignitatis Humanae belongs to John Paul II. Certainly, he is an authority in interpreting it because he is the one who implemented it for decades. The same thing with Cardinal Ratzinger when he was head of the CDF, or when he was Benedict XVI. Same with Francis, and Francis has developed it even further too in documents like Evangelii Gaudium, and many of the speeches they've made too on the World Day of Peace, and at many different ecumenical congresses, they've been affirming errors that were previously condemned and that are at variance with Catholic teaching. So that's kind of the next part in this series, bringing those together to strengthen this argument. That way, people like Thomas Pink say, for all their merits, they have just a methodological problem because their reading of the documents does not line up with who they say is the authority. So he would say that John Paul II was the authority, was the Pope, and yet his reading of these documents is at variance with that. So just you can discard with that argument. It doesn't have any value if you're appealing to something over and against the authority of John Paul II.
No. Let me attempt to share what I think is the pro-Murray side of this, because what Murray and others say, and what Dignitatis actually says, is that the human person has the right to not be coerced or infringed upon their right to religious expression, right? And what others will say as well, and I'm going to bring this up on the screen. This was actually a article written by a former professor of mine, Professor Pinero, Liberalism and Leo XIII. And his argument, and many others will say, is that although you might be right about Leo condemning liberalism and in his writings Immortali Dei, Quanta Cura, here's what Professor Pinero will argue. You are universalizing those teachings beyond the confessionally Catholic state in Europe that existed in the 1800s. You are therefore ignoring the development of Catholic social teaching since then. Dignitatis Humanae goes on to advance this. And I'll bring up one more quote too, that I'd like you to respond to all this. This is by Archbishop Chaput, formerly of the Philadelphia Archdiocese. He said this. He said, Pius IX wrote his Syllabus of Errors and Quanta Cura at a time when he had to be smuggled out of Rome to escape being killed. This is, again, from Archbishop Chaput, who's now retired. That event marked him deeply, he said. And he added, quote, all people are shaped by their time. Catholic resistance to modern thought was caused by the persecution of the church after the French Revolution and fears that the popular government might elsewhere do the same. So that's their argument. They're saying, look, the human person has a right to be wrong. The issue is not ever has no rights. It's the person has the right to be wrong. That the writings of the popes in the 1800s were conditioned by the time that they lived in. They were fearful of the French Revolution. And there's been developments in the church's teachings on this. So how do you respond to that?
No, those are good questions. And so to respond to the first, you would say, actually, I'll take the second one first. So a person has a right to be wrong. If you start to examine that and you understand that all rights are specified by their object, it quickly becomes obvious that no one has the right to be wrong. And so that's where scholastic philosophy is so important, because without that, these things are going to be more difficult to understand. And if you look at St. Thomas and the manuals before the Second Vatican Council, it is very clear that a right is defined, and Leo XIII confirmed this in Libertas too. A right is a moral power of acquiring something owed in justice and given by either natural or positive law. And all rights are specified by their objects. And so it has to be owed in justice. And ultimately, God is the author of all rights. And so it's absurd to say that you would ever have a right to err for that very reason.
Are they saying, though, maybe they have a civil right to be wrong, to err, and that in these modern times, because there is no Catholic majority state anymore, we need to adapt to this reality? Is that what the document's saying, maybe, or is it not?
They might be saying that, but that's still not true, because and I'll quote here from Pope Leo XIII and Immortale Dei, where he's talking about, and even to answer the first objection too, with the dignity. This is from Immortale Dei, number 32. He says, quote, if the mind assents to false opinions and the will chooses and follows after what is wrong, neither can attain its native fullness. Both must fall from their native dignity into an abyss of corruption. Whatever, therefore, is opposed to virtue and truth may not be rightly brought temptingly before the eye of man, much less sanctioned by the favor and protection of the law. And so that's why you can't, a lot of these people understand civil law at variance with the moral law, but that's not possible for Catholics. The two they work hand in hand. And so it is true that the civil law, insofar as it's just positive law, can change, but these things are against natural law and divine law and that kind of thing. So when a man is erring, he's actually falling from his native dignity. And that's a problem. And then the state has the duty to steer him back on the right course and to punish him if he's saying things that are false in religious and moral matters too. So that's how I would respond to that. And it's really the philosophy and understanding that rights are specified by their objects. So you could never say that do I have a right to not be prosecuted from the state in committing adultery, which is objectively sinful? Of course not. Then you take another thing that's objectively sinful, like the profession of a false religion. Do I have protection from the state to do that? Of course not. It's objectively sinful. It's just like adultery in that way. And if you were to admit that principle, that I now have the right to protection from the state in committing sin, I mean, just imagine the consequences of that. And that's what we're seeing, to take it to the present. That's what we're seeing today, where the civil law has sanctioned all of these abuses, and it's gotten so bad that the natural law has been thrown away.
Yeah. I mean, so I'll just read here just a brief part of Dignitatis Humanae. In religious matters, no one shall be forced to act against his conscience, nor hindered from acting within just limits in accordance with his conscience, in private and in public. Michael Davies makes the argument in his book on the council that the quote in public part is where the most obvious break here is. And he says, I think also You know, the just limits part, right? Because there were efforts at the council. Before I get into that, I'll read the rest of this. The right of the human person to religious freedom in the legal order of society must be recognized in such a way that it constitutes a civil right. This freedom is based on the dignity of the human person. And Archbishop Lefebvre said, like, there's two things: ontological dignity and operative dignity. And that's what you there with Leo is. Every person does have a sort of innate dignity based on the fact that they're a human person made in the image of God. But the further we fall away from our dignity, again, sin, as Thomas Aquinas says, destroys our dignity, right? There's no one, Lefebvre also said, there's no dignity in hell, right? So when you sin, you become a slave to sin. So your operative dignity is lost. So you become like someone who's like a criminal. They don't have a right to stay in civil society. They lose their right to be out there. And so you could say, like, the promulgation of error or heresy. Again, the Vatican II document just says, you know, it praises the special value of non-Catholic religions. But the church used to call them cults and sects and things, but then Vatican II comes along and has to be ecumenical, right? So it says just, you know, general statements about them saying whatever they want. It doesn't make a judgment on what they're saying is right or wrong. But objectively speaking, when Protestantism is being promulgated in the public arena, it is, you could say, an attack on truth and on God and the public order and the common good. And so, like, they tried to fit in so many things to make this still traditional, like, you know, within just limits, right? And then also there was another part in Dignitatis Humanae that speaks about it has to be in accordance with the objective moral order. Well, how can you know what the objective moral order is if you're not Catholic? I mean, there's always going to be, you can only find that in Scripture and in Revelation in the Catholic religion. So, you know, they tried to stitch this thing together, and you know what they did? They didn't really explain it all. Father John Coleman, here's a quote, and maybe you've read this, as a professor at Loyola Marymount University, has said, quote, Dignitatis Humanae, quote, evokes a development of doctrine, yet it fails to state and justify any explicit theory of development of doctrine. You know, so they just threw everything at the wall, thought they could just pass it, and without even knowing, like, how they did it.
No, you're exactly right, and it's gratuitous. So if you could actually go back to the essay from Father Belmont, and if you scroll down just a little bit, he says, and I love this part, he says, I called propositions B prime, A prime, and C prime 3 principles, and those are coming from Dignitatis Humanae, that are presented as universal, independent of circumstances, as they are founded on the very nature of man under the aspect of dignity. And so that's where quanta cura is also something that is promulgated, and it's independent of the circumstances. It is true that the church was reacting to those errors of liberalism and secularism, but they were reproved independently of the circumstances. It's not contingent upon that. And so, like a lot of the defenders of the document try and distort the traditional teaching, and they make it seem as if it's contingent. That's not true either. And so, if you scroll up now, please, more to the beginning, and this is my preface, where John Paul II is quoted. Sorry, a little bit more. Almost. He confirms also that it's not religious tolerance. So if you scroll up a little bit more. That's a good one. Actually, let's start with that one first. Sorry.
And what are these quotes here from?
Okay, so these are from John Paul II. And he says in public speeches on the world, and these are all linked to, I made sure to cite them. The links are there. These are verbatim. The only thing I've done is, and I mentioned this in the preface, is that I've put certain emphases in bold, but I did mention that. But other than that, it's word for word. So his public speeches on the World Day of Peace in 1988 and to the diplomatic corps in 1990 witness to the same. So he says, quote, the state cannot claim authority, direct or indirect, over a person's religious convictions. It cannot arrogate itself the right to impose or to impede the profession or public practice of religion by a person or a community. So that's a complete repudiation of Christendom, because the state would punish those that held the Catholic religion and fell away into heresy or schism physically. The state has the right to coerce its subjects, either physically or morally. And then if you scroll down, he says, even in cases where the state grants a special juridical position to a particular religion, there is a duty to ensure that the right to freedom of conscience is legally recognized and effectively respected for all citizens, and also for foreigners living in the country, even temporarily, for reasons of employment and the like. And that's just a stunning admission, because if you look in the syllabus of 1864, he nearly says word for word, and I'll read this one because I have it pulled up. He says nearly word for word what Proposition 78 was that was reproved. And Pope Pius IX reproved, hence it has been wisely decided by law in some Catholic countries that persons coming to reside in therein shall enjoy the public exercise of their own peculiar worship. And then the final quote I'd like to bring out from John Paul II, if you scroll up just a little bit, he's talking about Islam in a glowing way, as usual. Number 16, he says, I'm convinced that the great traditions of Islam, such as welcoming strangers, and I'll skip ahead, he says, I express my earnest hope that if Muslim believers nowadays rightly find in countries of Christian tradition the facilities needed for satisfying the demands of their religion, then Christians will similarly be able to benefit from a comparable treatment in all countries of Islamic.
It's a quid pro quo, right? We'll stop defending Christ the King, and then you can give us all right.
And then look what he follows up. He says, religious freedom cannot be limited to a simple tolerance. It is a civil and social reality matched by specific rights, enabling believers, and when he says believers, it's not exclusively Catholics, and their communities to witness without fear. So these are just like the most damning quotes. I don't see how you could defend any of this as a Catholic and the teaching that has been received previously.
It reminds me of, I'm going to bring up this segment from Raymond Arroyo's program quite a few years ago, because maybe you've seen this. It's George Weigel, who is still clinging to the errors of the council and the arguments made by Murray. And one of the arguments Murray made is that the state is incompetent, and you saw that reflected in what you just read here with John Paul II. The state is incompetent on religious questions, right? It's that the state, just like James Madison said, has no duty to bind people's consciences anymore, right? So I'll play this quote, or this it's several years old. It's probably over 15 years ago, but I'll get your reaction to it because he defends the council.
The Catholics' perennial position and commitment to the kingship of Christ in America, for example, to a constitutional amendment, perhaps, of declaring Christ king, and to use some of the language from our apostolic mandate that Pius.
They're getting quite uncomfortable. You can tell.
I know. They're almost embarrassed.
I'm just trying to recall. He referred to them ceasing to call themselves Catholics, but referred to democracy.
Okay, we've got Eric. I think I've got it. I've got to move on, but I'll let Jody quickly respond to that. This notion of declaring the kingship of Christ upon the nation. I mean, this is something that Richard probably would not support, yes?
No, not at all. He would have thought that this was a fundamentally un-American idea, precisely because America is not a Catholic country. And we're a country born from the rejection of kings. Now, Christ is the king, but he is the king of we as individuals, and thus we are called to something beyond the nation. I think Richard would have seen the changes that happened from Leo XIII on, in Catholic social teaching and Catholic understanding, particularly of Vatican II, of democracy.
So real quick, they're talking about Father Richard Newhouse, I believe. This was probably around the time that he passed. Father Newhouse was a former Lutheran clergyman who converted to Catholicism later in life and helped found First Things, which was a neocon pro-conciliar organization. So this guy here was the editor-in-chief of that. So I'll keep playing this. That's just for context who he's referring to there.
And there are possibilities for allowing Catholic life to flourish. I think Richard would have seen the sort of movement to have an American constitutional amendment to declare Christ the King as a retrograde movement.
George, I think he would also say, as John Paul II would say, as the Second Vatican Council would say, that that's simply not the business of the state. That the state is incompetent to make those sorts of judgments. A state that could say Christ is king is a state that could say Charles III or George VII or whatever, the son of Queen
Muhammad or whoever,
or Muhammad or Oprah Winfrey is queen. I mean,
we're almost there, George.
The deeper point is that the state is incompetent to make theological judgments. The guys who can't fix the potholes should not be settling the theological arguments. This is important to recognize because it puts the state in its proper place. The state is important for certain functions, but it does not have the capacity to make the judgment that Christ is king.
All right, your response.
Oh my goodness. And I'm almost attempted to call that just impious. I mean, the number of errors that were in that, but also they said some true things, like where the one guy said that that's anti-American to make Christ the king. I would agree. And that's the problem. I would totally agree. Like if you were to go out in today's society and you were to affirm Catholic principles, Catholic social teaching, they would accuse you of being anti-American. And I think descriptively, that is true, the way being American is understood today. And I don't think we should equivocate and walk from that. We should actually challenge those false principles and those taboos, because the country is never going to get better if its foundation is rotten. Mm-hmm. And what's funny is that he mentioned John Paul II and the council to justify that, which I agree with. But if you look at John Paul II's professor, Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, who, and I'm curious if you've seen this too, I've been meaning to investigate it. I heard that he did not approve of his doctoral thesis. Have you seen that?
I need to look more into that too. I know Lagrange said something to the effect of writes a lot, says a little on his thesis or something. So I don't think he had much high praise for.
But it was actually, I looked at this a while back. I believe it was from George Weigel's book, because he wrote the official biography of John Paul II, and he actually communicated in it. And I'm not saying this for certain. I still need to investigate it, but I'm pretty sure that John Paul II's thesis was turned down because he said it reeked of modernism, and it was written in a personalist style, which is obviously wrong. And there's actually a really good treatment of this on the duty of the state and society of accepting divine revelation as sufficiently proposed. And so we've talked about Pope Leo XIII earlier in Libertas, where he was making that explicit in the ecclesiastical magisterium. But then you have theologians in the 20th century, and Garrigou wrote this in the early 20th century, where he was confirming that same principle, that it is independent of circumstances. And it's in his De Revelatione manual, volume 2, chapter 15, article 4. So I'm going to be actually publishing that pretty soon on my journal, just to get more eyes on that, because I think it's very helpful for Catholics, whether they think that the Second Vatican Council is in continuity with Catholic tradition or whether they don't, just to see what the earlier theologians said on these matters and confirm what the ecclesiastical magisterium had already taught. And so that's where it's funny that they're appealing to John Paul II, and it's like, yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah, there's so much to go through on that clip. I mean, what they're espousing, saying the state is incompetent, that's the liberal conception of the state, that the state is a bare bones, minimal, like libertarian institution to just kind of keep like general public order, right? That's not the Catholic view of the state. The Catholic view of the state, here's a quote from Pius X, St. Pius X, Vehementer Nos, that the state must be separated from the church is a thesis absolutely false, a most pernicious error. Based on it is the principle that the state must not recognize any religious cult. In this case, it is guilty of a great injustice to God, for the creator of man is also the founder of human societies and preserves their existence. We owe him, therefore, not only a private cult, as was mentioned in that video, but a public and social one. And so, they will say, and John Paul said this to Lefebvre when Lefebvre asked him, what about the Quanta Cura? What about this social kingship of Christ? John Paul said, well, Christ is king of our hearts now, right? Of individuals, as the guy said in the video.
Yes.
But it fails to, I fail to understand how, because Leo mentioned this himself too in his encyclicals. Nations are simply collections of individuals, right? What is true for a person is true for the state or for a country or for the world, right? Because the world, nations, countries, cities, towns, these are collections of individuals. So you can't say, therefore, that someone who, the 10 Commandments are 10 Commandments, right? They're not just for persons, but for society, right? And so, what they will do, what Weigel will do, this is what Murray's effort was to do, was to change the Catholic concept of political theory, the state, the nation, etc., and to make it more Americanist and to baptize it, basically to become more Madisonian. And the error in doing that is, again, you lose that ability of the state to do its duty, because the state is a creature, as Father Fenton and Connell argued. And what they will do is, again, they'll make the whole personalist argument, right? That, as you mentioned there, John Paul was a personalist. He was he sort of corrupted the faith to make it more into a philosophical school of thought. And he wrote about Kant, I believe, too, as well. And so, like, when you read the document, the Dignitatis Humanae, again, they will make it about the person has the right to err. The person, the dignity of the human person, dignity of the human person. Well, again, that's not not a sure foundation, because as you've already mentioned, as Aquinas mentioned and others, what Leo mentioned, when you sin, when you fall into sin, when you subscribe to either a heresy or a falsehood, you're losing your dignity. Objectively speaking, you're not in reality. And so to say like, oh, a person has the right to be wrong, well, it was a Cardinal Taviani and Father Fenton who I think said like, well, error can only be put forth by persons. So what are you saying here? And so what they do, again, Weigel and these people, these neocons who will just protect the Murray legacy, who himself, again, admitted he does not know how the development occurred. Okay, they still haven't explained it. They will not quote from those thorny encyclicals by Leo and St. Pius X that totally refute them, right?
Yes.
This is why when you always see like First Things and Others, which is an ecumenical outfit, by the way, they are doing what they're saying because they don't want to offend Protestants and Jews. They will bring up Rerum Novarum. Everybody knows Leo XIII wrote Rerum Novarum, but you won't hear them bring up Libertas. You won't hear them bring up his other one on civil society. And you won't hear them bring up all the other issues that St. Pius X wrote, or even Pius XI, because they need to be selective about what they present to the people, because they know that they are condemned by them and they have no good response to it. So, yeah.
No, that's exactly right. And you are right, these outlets, because neo-conservatism, that's a Jewish creation, a Jewish project. And they are very concerned about not offending Jews and Protestants, and they're very ecumenical like that. And the one thing I did want to clarify, and I'm sure you intended to say this, is that when we're looking at the Catholic conception of the state, they're not composed immediately of individuals. Rather, they're composed immediately of families. So that's even more against that. And that's really coming from the Protestant notion of radical individualism, which then applied to the political order. You see the dissolution of the state, you see the dissolution of the family, but they're still operating in that framework. And that's why the one gentleman said that, no, Jesus is just the king of our heart, nothing more than that. I mean, that's in contravention of what Pope Pius XI taught in Quas Primas, when he was talking about each state, each nation, each man, each family, each woman, and so on, are all bound to recognize our Lord Jesus Christ as king. And it's the social kingship of Christ and the mystical body of the church that is permeating society. So I wanted to mention that, because I'm sure you meant to say that too.
Absolutely.
And then the other thing is that on the dignity point, you're totally right. And St. Thomas actually says that when a man sins gravely, he actually becomes lower than a beast. He loses that moral dignity and he becomes lower than a beast because he's perverted his reason. And now that ontological dignity persists, but even that dignity is not absolute because we're created. And so that's where you see a very recent document that came out, Dignitatis Infinitas, that's very subversive, because it's that absolute dignity applied to man, and there's no longer a distinction made between his moral dignity, which can be lost, and the ontological dignity, which is not absolute, but there is dignity. That's a very real concept. So those are kind of conflated, and then the absolute dignity that belongs exclusively to God is then transitioned to man. And so that's kind of the philosophical errors that are underpinning a lot of these problems that we're then seeing put forth at the council.
And this is again continued by folks like Ryan Anderson. If you don't know who he is, he's very much of the George Weigel liberal Catholic. George Weigel's a liberal Catholic, right? So we need to understand that. Father John Cody Murray, liberal Catholic, right? Ryan Anderson went to Princeton, studied under Robert George, a liberal Catholic, right? And so, these are the sorts of Catholics. Again, Ethics and Public Policy Center, they're very well known in DC. And so they take that Americanist attitude and they think like, if we just go back to the founding, like that's the solution. So here's a quote from Ryan years ago that he said, without a return to the principles of the American founding, ordered liberty based on faith and reason, natural rights and morality, limited government and civil society, America will continue to face serious and perplexing questions. Well, okay, it sounds nice in principle, right? Everyone wants that, limited government, faith and reason. But of course, there's only one true faith, right? And as St. Pius X said, there's no true civilization without a moral civilization, and no true moral civilization without the true religion. That was St. Pius X. And here's also Pope Leo XIII. Society cannot be set up unless the church lays the foundation. Only a return to Christian life, by that he means Catholic life, and institutions will heal it. Okay, and here's furthermore, as you said, Pius XI just there. When men recognize, both in public and private, that Christ is king, society will be at last receive the great blessings of real liberty, right? We're not just talking about the liberty of the founding, right? Real liberty is well-ordered to Christ and the Catholic religion. So it's tricky to kind of untangle all this, because a lot of the language that's used by these people who are in DC, who are, again, they're neocons, they're liberal Catholics, sounds very Catholic. You can read a Catholic lens into that. But again, it was Joseph de Maistre, who was a counter-revolutionary anti-liberal in the 1800s, as a Catholic, French. He said, no public morals nor national character without religion. And he also said, no European religion without Christianity. No true Christianity without Catholicism. Mm-hmm. So again, it's not just Christ or chaos, it's Catholicism or chaos. And so these people who just want to go back to the founding, right? Limited government, etc. Sounds nice, but you need the people to be Catholic. And Vatican II is standing in the way because of ecumenism, because of its new liturgy, its modernist ecumenical liturgy. People are not able to actually go back to tradition and be Catholic because it's standing in the way. So, like, that's the problem. And until that's solved, as you're mentioning here, like, we need to recover the church's traditional teachings on church-state relations to even have a chance at saving this country, to save the world, really, right? Because until that happens, it's just like we're going to keep going around parroting liberal talking points and giving it a sort of Catholic veneer, but it's not really getting rid of the problem.
That's right. And it has to be integral. It has to be done at the state, and we need all the institutions permeated by Catholic social teaching, and we need a restoration, really. And that's really the problem with something like liberty, because the way it's used in America is equivocal. There is a proper understanding of liberty, and Catholics are great defenders of liberty. Now, because we live in this country, you have to qualify it like that, because the way liberty is understood by Americans, it's license. It's the right to do whatever I want, independent of God's laws, independent of the natural law, independent of the authority of the church. That's how liberty is understood in America. So we have to be, as Catholics, very careful about not giving into that false notion of liberty, which so permeates all society. And that was there at the founding. I mean, that is baked into everything. And so, and the same thing with the freedom of worship. Something that has been very helpful for me has been reading these older authors, the ones in the 19th and early 20th century, on what they had to say about all these different liberal doctrines. And one really good one is Cardinal Zigliara. He was a Dominican, and he was actually one of the principal authors of Rerum Novarum, which you were talking about. And yeah, I'm on that one right now. And he says, freedom of worship viewed in itself is absurd. This proposition remains primarily proved from what has been said above. For freedom of worship is inferred only from freedom of conscience. By granting man freedom of worship, God is deprived of the power to impose a specific worship on men, and a certain obligation is imposed on God to accept, or at least approve, any worship presented to him by human reason. And so I mean, I think this is really the antidote to the problems we're not only seeing in America, but also the crisis in the church. These older authors have addressed these errors, and we kind of need to rediscover this and equip people. And it is a little bit difficult. You might have to read it a couple of times, but they are diagnosing these errors. They understand them, and then they're refuting them, and they're using beautiful Catholic principles to do that.
Yeah. I want to bring this quote up too from Father Avery Dulles, who was very much someone who was an ally of Weigel and Richard Newhouse and First Things. He said Vatican II was essentially, quote, a compromise between the vision of the church as a hierarchical and divine society oriented toward eternal life, and the newer vision of the church as a free society called to serve the human community. I mean, to me, that sounds just completely Masonic and I mean, just awful. But I think the larger point, what you're actually saying here, and we have about maybe 15 minutes left to go here. And thanks everybody for tuning in. By the way, it's a great conversation I'm having with American Reform. Go to his blog, Substack, Twitter account. We'll check it out before we sign off today. Go to our Twitter account as well. Follow me at Stephen Kokx. Click like or subscribe to this YouTube channel on Rumble. But I think the real issue, what really happened, as far as I can tell, I think it was C.S. Lewis who said the devil sends errors into the world like 2 at a time, and to trick men into embracing one or the other. And in my view, the liberalism of the French Revolution and the liberalism of the American Revolution is what he did there. And so, like, the church reacted very strongly because it's very close to the liberalism of the French Revolution, right? They saw it in its most raw form, anti-clerical, anti-Catholic, etc. Yes. And then the American Revolution was a bit more softer, right? And they were, the founders of the U.S. were, Protestant, generally believed in God, talked about Jesus a lot. They weren't necessarily, they were all like very much anti-Catholics, but they certainly allowed Catholics to have space, right? And I think, that's what happened, is that people like Murray, people like Weigel and other Americanists, they fell for the trap that was set for them and it said, oh, well, we can adapt the church's teachings to the American founding situation, and we can borrow some of that ideology and language, and we can just make that the church's teaching itself in a sort of modified way. And it's coming back to bite them, because once you sort of make peace with the revolution eats its own, right? And this is what we're living through, is that the American Revolution is now fully blossomed, and its inner principles, as Patrick Deneen wrote about, are showing their true colors. Yes. Because at the heart of liberalism is the idea the person is supreme, that the individual and his or her choice is the ultimate reason for existence, is to choose. And so if I want to choose to be a woman, I can choose to be a woman. If I want to choose to divorce my spouse, I get to choose that. There's no ties incumbent upon me. And so what we're seeing is the full flourishing of the liberal era. And for Catholics to try to cling to liberalism to thwart off liberalism, in other words, to say, let's go back to the founding of the U.S., right? Faith and reason, discourse, public discourse. That's a sort of a false solution, because it's within the liberal order. And the same thing with Vatican II is why the conservatives, Cardinal Burke and others, they just want to go back to the founding of the conciliar church, right? The 1776 in the church was 1965. Yeah. And so they want to go back to the original documents of the council, interpret them the right way, get the right mass, right? And implement the Novus Ordo in the way it was always intended to. Just like the founding, we got to go back to the founding and go back to the way the founders always intended. It's the same thing. It's just replaying itself. And yet that's not the solution. The solution is to become traditional, right? To go back to previously, before the council, before the devil laid those errors for us to fall prey to, and to go back to Christendom before the liberalism of the founders and of the French Revolution was here. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. That's why I sort of look at this whole situation, and is why more people need to become traditional and not operate within the confines of the conciliar church, or in a sense, the American situation structure set up as well. We need to go back to Christendom. We need to go back to tradition, pre-Vatican II, pre-American Revolution.
Yes, and that's a very keen insight. And I like how you drew that same principle to the American liberalism, which is a more moderate kind than the French radicalism. And so that's a really good principle to draw to the current crisis in the church, because then you have kind of the so-called hermeneutic of continuity, which is trying to make peace between Christ and Belial, between truth and error, light and darkness. And then you have Catholic teaching as it has always been understood and always been taught. And so one argument that I'm putting forward in a lot of my work, and I may be the only one, perhaps I'm not, but I haven't seen anyone else doing it, is that the American liberalism is actually much more dangerous than the French kind, because the French kind is in your face. It's anti-clerical. It's very easy to
It's sort of like Pope Francis and Leo. One's radical, the other's a soft-spoken moderate, right?
So so the externals are much more friendly for the American style revolutionism, because that's what it is. It is a Masonic Protestant Enlightenment project, but it is a little bit more moderated than the French variety. That was very much violent too. And the same thing with Bolshevism and communism. Conservatism in any of its forms is liberalism. And so, but it's subtle. it has this veneer of respectability, whereas communism, it's very in your face, it's very radical, very violent. But for people, especially most people, it's easier to recognize the danger that's present in communism than in conservatism or the American liberalism at the founding. And so I had somewhat of a public dispute with Gideon Lazar, if you're familiar with him, on X, where he was saying that America is a Catholic country and always has been, and basically asserting that by fiat. So I actually wrote an entire response to him, going point by point why that was not true on my Substack. And that
what was the arguments he made? Was it that the Constitution itself is not anti-Catholic, separation of powers? What was his argument?
The argument was, in the 19th century, there was a Supreme Court decision where a Justice Brewer upheld a decision on blasphemy laws, which is true. There were blasphemy laws, but that's Protestantism. I mean, a principled Protestant is going to have, first of all, the principled Protestant is not going to grant religious freedom to Catholics. He should not. In principle, that wouldn't make sense. That's a false religion. The state should repress the Catholicism if you were a Protestant. It doesn't make sense to grant Catholics freedom of religion if you were a Protestant. And the same is true for us. Obviously, we are not going to allow them to spread their religious and moral errors. So he was kind of making this very triumphalistic argument based on this one Supreme Court decision. And I went through it point by point. And the other thing too is that a lot of people, and I'm not saying that he was of bad will, he's not, but I think he's very misguided in the arguments he's advancing publicly. Like you can see there, he's very triumphalistic about America being a Christian nation. But the real problem in America is that Christian has an equivocal meaning, unfortunately. It only means Roman Catholics, strictly speaking. You could only call a Protestant a Christian in a very qualified sense. And so, but in America, we use that. We don't really distinguish between that. And so that's an unfortunate usage of the language. And these were the big 10 errors. And there's more that could be added, but that would make it impossible to say America is or ever was a Christian nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, I'm welcome to have you go into some of this, because I think this is the next sort of debate in all this. Is like, well, what is our role or duty as Catholics in this nation now? Is Christian or Catholic nationalism acceptable? I know Taylor Marshall just wrote a book called Christian Patriotism. Again, using a vague term, we don't know what he's referring to there. It's sort of ecumenical. So, I mean, what are your comments on that going forward? I mean, I know there's been also side question would be, can you comment on the scholarship that's been taken up more recently on the question of, is Vatican II in continuity or not with previous teachings? I know this is Thomas Pink and John Lamont, but maybe those are two separate questions, and we'll just kind of close with that.
Okay. Yeah, very good. And I do see in both of those camps, there is kind of a convergence. They are putting forward, I wouldn't say this of the Josias or Thomas Pink. I don't think they are tolerating American style liberalism. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen that in their writings, and they're very good in many ways. But I do disagree with them on their hermeneutic, so-called, of continuity between Dignitatis Humanae. And also what's important is that Dignitatis Humanae does not exist in isolation. We've now had 70 years of conciliar reforms that's all that data that needs to be admitted in the argument. And so you can't read Dignitatis Humanae against the authentic interpretation of Francis or John Paul II or Benedict XVI or all of their approved theologians who all witness to what we would call rupture, what they would just assert as development, organic development. But I am seeing, it's unfortunate politically for America, people aren't willing to do the right thing, the only thing that's going to work. And that is going to be what I'm calling a refounding. We need a new state. We need to set America up on the right track. And that is the true, I think, American patriotism. It is to uphold the rights of God first and foremost. It is to uphold the rights of the Catholic Church. And there's an element of not being needlessly inflammatory in doing that. But I think we are so late in the hour. We do not need to be worrying about if we're offending Protestants, Jews, Muslims, atheists, these kinds of types. We need and this is a really interesting discussion, but we probably don't have time for it. When it comes to Trump and the Republican Party, I'm saying that Catholics need to stop supporting the Republican Party. We need a new party. We need something that is decidedly anti-liberal, that is explicitly Catholic. And there's so much solidarity that could be generated between white Americans, between Catholics. There's so much solidarity in those groups. And if we were to band together, we could actually start to effectuate some real political change. And then also through the institutions. I think that's really the big thing, is that we don't need to make these populist appeals. It's really the institutions, the levers of power that need to be wielded for the good. And so that's kind of the unfortunate consequence of conservatism and libertarianism, is this allergy to exercising power and using it for the good and upholding the rights of God. And that's why, I mean, our society is so degraded now and morals are so low. I mean, people are just, they're in some of the worst shape ever, to say nothing of their the spiritual state of America. And so that to me is a really, really big problem. And that's why I think it has to be a fundamental reform, not merely an accidental one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big ask, but I think, Catholics, especially trads, are up for it because they know that they've been on the front lines of this for so long. Yes. And they don't mind the battle, because I think what you're seeing right now, especially in the Trad Inc. movement, is people who are tired, they're fatigued, they don't want to keep fighting this battle, they just want their Latin Mass, and they want to move on. But I think what you're talking about is something much more than that. And if you go to, I would encourage viewers, if you haven't read this before, this is an article I wrote in 2019. Catholics fed up with liberalism will find inspiration in 1940s Integrity magazine reprints. And Integrity magazine was way ahead of its time. These were like what you would consider like rad trads writing in the 1940s and 50s, because they understood what was going on in the American polity. I'm not sure if you've heard of these guys, but they were from New York, and they wrote a lot of books about. Let's see if I can find something here. Let's see. Barbas was Alex. Alex is a friend of mine. He's writing how this was. Here's the key quote from their first issue in 1940, I think 42 maybe. We must make a new synthesis of religion and life. Integral Catholicism does not mean piety so much as wholeness. It means a consistency of theory and practice, a unity of public life and private morals, a reconciliation of commercial ethics and religious dogma. The guiding policy of contemporary society is to compromise, but integral Catholicism is the opposite of expediency. Integral Catholicism does not calculate its actions to please worldly powers or political parties, or with an eye to the coming elections. We must do what is right, come what may. And if you want to find more about them, I'm trying to find a link here, guys, so bear with me as a
that's actually
crazy.
That's amazing. I have not heard of them. I will definitely check this out. And I'm good on LifeSite. I've been seeing what LifeSite has been publishing. I'm very happy that they're publishing you and many others. That's excellent. And I will definitely take a look at that, because that's kind of in all of my research. And this was a term, I don't know if it was coined by Monsignor Umberto Benigni, but he used the term integrally Catholic.
Yep.
And so, you really don't need to qualify Catholic, but today I think it can be very helpful. And America, unfortunately, there has been a noticeable absence of that integralism, that intransigence that I think is needed more now than ever. And we have this principle of compromise, and it's so baked in. So I will definitely check that out. And that's great, because you see that in France, there were many integralists, Italy, Jesuits, they were excellent. But in America, there's an absence of that.
Yeah, and that this came from Americans is even more pretty cool, because here's what it looks like. This is from Aruka Press. Alex Barbas is a friend of mine. He is a big fan of Carol Robinson, who is a Thomist, and very much brought him to the modern world. I mean, their articles are just amazing. So go on here, do check them out. Here's Alex's website. Scroll down. There's 3 volumes. So it's sort of like a forgotten organization. They're really like, like if you're familiar with the group, who was it? After the council, Bozell started the movement. He moved to Spain. Triumph magazine, right?
Okay.
Triumph magazine was started by Brent Bozell in, I think, the late 60s. And he wanted it to be a sort of revolutionary magazine. And there's a lot of young people today looking to Bozell and the this Triumph magazine. But I compare Integrity to like Triumph on steroids and before the council. So they knew like what Murray and others were up to before the council, and they called it out. They're really great. So anyone willing to check that out, do that. That's a great. Here's another book by Carol Robinson. I'll bring this up real quick.
I saw it
Breaking
on the table of contents there. It was a critique of capitalism and socialism. That's great. I think because that is so dogmatized in America, the liberal capitalism, the condemned kind, because there is a legitimate system. It's not the best one, but there is a legitimate system of capitalism that can be admitted if you want. But it's the liberal capitalism is the predominant strain, and the libertarianism, that pernicious air, is so captured. Otherwise patriotic people, like there are so many good men in this country that are still ensconced in that liberal ideology, which is libertarianism. And we all know who is behind all of that. But I will definitely check that out. Thank you.
Here's just some articles, titles of some of the articles that appeared in Integrity. The family has lost its head. Why aren't Americans contemplative? How modern man became merry. What is a grown-up? Recreation and children. Forward to the Lamb. About television, etc. So they were way ahead of their time. It's a great resource. But thank you for being so much with us today, American Reform. And I know we probably missed a topic or two, but what else you want to add to our show today, and tell our viewers who've made it this long, an hour and a half into the program, anything else?
Yes, and apologies for being a little bit heady, and I know we got into some technical arguments, but I think they are very important to make, and these distinctions especially are so important. But thank you for having me on your show, and please go check out Stephen's Substack and his writing at LifeSite News or anything like that. If those articles are there, check that out. And then for me, if you're interested in what I'm working on, please go take a look at my Substack. And we focus mostly on race and its relationship to Catholicism. Like I was saying before, we talk about nationalism, feminism, a lot of the modern errors that are in our country right now. The Jewish question is another topic. And then also political philosophy. And so a lot of things that most people have not heard critique before, like the separation of powers, something that is sacrosanct in America. Catholic authors have written against it, and that's a principle from the Enlightenment. So things like that, if you're interested, please go check out my Substack. And Stephen, thank you very much for having me on. It really means a lot. And if you've ever like to have a discussion like this again, let me know.
Absolutely. And do go follow him on X here, American Reform. This is a fantastic picture of Father Coughlin. Yes. And this looks like it's Pius the 12th as a diplomat, who could have been better on some things, but he's okay. Go check that out. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. This is a fantastic show. It does take time and energy to make these programs. So if you're really excited and pleased with the program and the production of today, do go check us out, support our work on Substack. You can go to us, buymeacoffee.com, and support us there, a one-time donation, or become a subscriber to our Cox News Reports at Substack. So again, thank you, American Reform, for coming on. It's been a pleasure. We wish all of you, everybody, thank you for tuning in today, and God bless.